Picture this. A young woman stands on the deck of a steamship somewhere in the South China Sea. The year is 1911. She has no mission board behind her, no salary, no return ticket. In her coat pocket, a single folded letter from a pastor back home in Indiana, who told her plainly that she was throwing her life away. She was 26 years old, and she was smiling. Her name was Edith Millicent Graybill. Most people who knew her called her Millie. Most people who knew her also told her, at one point or another, that she was too much, too intense, too stubborn, too convinced that God had said something He almost certainly had not said to a girl like her. She had heard that her whole life. She stopped listening a long time ago. Millie was born in 1885 in a small farming town outside of Terre Haute, Indiana. The kind of town where the church was the tallest building, and everyone knew which families had money and which ones didn't. The Graybills didn't. Her father, a quiet man named Thomas, worked the same 40 acres his own father had broken. And every autumn he would stand at the edge of the field with his hat in his hands and do the math in his head and come back into the house, looking a little older than he had that morning. Her mother, Nella, was the kind of woman who ran on 3 hours of sleep and 2 cups of strong coffee and the absolute conviction that God had placed her family in her hands for a reason. She sang while she cooked. She prayed while she washed. On winter mornings when the pump froze and the wood stove wouldn't draw, she would stand in the kitchen and speak quietly to the Lord about it, like she was talking to a neighbor across a fence. Millie grew up watching her mother and deciding that whatever that was, that intimacy, that ease, she wanted it for herself. She didn't get it easily. As a girl, she was restless in church. She found the sermons long and the hymns too slow and the whole enterprise too managed, too settled, too much like a comfortable arrangement between respectable people and a God who had been talked into behaving reasonably. She wanted something she couldn't name. She sat in the wooden pews every Sunday morning with her hands folded in her lap and her mind somewhere entirely else, and she didn't know whether to feel guilty about it or not. When she was 12, her younger brother Caleb got sick. Typhoid. The doctor came twice, and the second time he didn't say much on his way out, which said everything. Her mother sat by Caleb's bed every night for 10 days and prayed in a voice so low Millie could only hear it as a kind of steady murmur through the wall, a sound like water moving under ice. Caleb recovered. The doctor called it unexpected. Nella said nothing about that. She just changed the sheets and made broth and thanked the Lord quietly, like a woman returning a borrowed tool. Millie was 12 years old, and she understood. In the wordless way, children sometimes understand the most important things, that something real had happened in that room. Something that did not fit inside the managed, reasonable religion she had been sitting through every Sunday of her life. She started praying differently after that. Not out of duty, out of hunger. By the time she was 18, she had read everything in the church library twice, and was borrowing books from the county seat, and writing letters to missionaries she had never met, asking questions that no one around her seemed to think were appropriate for a young woman to be asking. What does it feel like when the Spirit moves? How do you know the difference between your own mind and God's voice? Have you ever prayed for something impossible and watched it happen? Some of them wrote back. Most of them were kind. A few of them were extraordinary. One letter, from a woman named Clara Forsyth, who was working in China with the China Inland Mission, arrived in the spring of 1904. Millie read it 4 times sitting at the kitchen table, and then she folded it carefully and put it in the Bible she kept beside her bed in the book of Isaiah, and she left it there for 7 years. She didn't know yet what she was waiting for, but she was waiting. The summer of 1906 changed things. Word traveled slowly in those days, but it traveled. By August, people in Indiana were hearing stories coming out of Los Angeles. A warehouse on Azusa Street, a black preacher named Seymour, services that went until 3 in the morning, people speaking in languages they had never learned, healings that didn't have clean explanations, something that sounded to some people like the Book of Acts running loose in California. The respectable churches didn't know what to make of it. Most of them decided not to make anything of it. Millie rode the train to Indianapolis to hear a man who had been to Azusa Street speak at a small meeting in a rented hall. There were maybe 40 people there. He was not a polished speaker. He was a carpenter from Sacramento, and he stood at the front of that hall with his big hands gripping the sides of the podium. And he talked for 2 hours about what he had seen and experienced, and when he finished, he asked if anyone wanted to pray. Millie was the first person out of her seat. She knelt on the floor of that hall in Indianapolis, on thin carpet that smelled like dust and old wood, and she prayed. Not the managed, organized kind, the other kind. The kind her mother used in the dark by Caleb's bed. And somewhere in the middle of it, she couldn't say exactly when, something broke loose inside her. Something she had been holding closed for years without knowing she was holding it. She wept. She didn't mind. She had always been too much, and tonight she decided that was fine. She went home to Terre Haute on the late train and sat in the dark, rattling car looking out at the Indiana flatland rolling by, and she knew, with the clarity of someone who has been waiting a long time for a clear signal, that she was going somewhere. She didn't know where. She didn't know when. But the thing that had opened in that hall in Indianapolis was not going to close, and whatever it led to, she was going to follow it. Her father asked her the next morning at breakfast how the meeting was. "Good," she said. He looked at her for a moment over his coffee cup. "You look different," he said. "I feel different," she said. He nodded slowly in the way of a man who has learned not to ask too many questions. And they finished breakfast in companionable silence, and 3 weeks later she told her parents she believed God was calling her to China. Her father set down his fork. Her mother said, "I know." Nobody else was as gracious about it. The pastor of their church, a careful man named Reverend Hollis, who wore the same suit every Sunday and had been to seminary in Cincinnati and was genuinely, sincerely trying to do right by his congregation. He sat across from Millie in his study and explained to her, patiently and not without kindness, all the reasons why this was not wise. She had no training, no mission board backing, no language preparation, no money. She was a 21-year-old woman from a farm family with no connections to the established missionary societies, and the established missionary societies, he said, existed for good reasons. He was right about all of that. She thanked him for his time and went home and started learning Chinese from a grammar book she ordered through the mail. It took 5 years, not because she was slow, but because she was thorough. She learned Mandarin. She found a Chinese student at the university in Indianapolis who was willing to correct her pronunciation in exchange for English conversation practice. She saved money from working at a dry goods store and later at a milliner's shop where she got along well with the owner because they were both the kind of women who knew exactly what they thought and weren't apologetic about it. She wrote to missionaries in China. She read everything she could find. She prayed every morning before the house was awake, and every night after it went quiet, and she prayed in a way that she had never been able to explain to anyone's full satisfaction. Not in organized sentences with clear requests. More like staying in the room, sitting still in the same place until the noise in her own head settled and something else came through. She had learned this in the months after Indianapolis. She had learned that there was a place past the words, past the asking, past the managing, and that place was where the actual thing happened. She called it the hidden place. She never wrote a book about it. She never gave it a formal name. It was just where she went. In that place, over 5 years of early mornings and late nights in Terre Haute, Indiana, she received what she could only describe as a certainty. Not feelings, not impressions. Certainty. She was going to China. She was going to a province most people in America couldn't find on a map. She was going without a salary or an organization or a letter of endorsement from anyone with credentials. And something was going to happen there that she had not been told the details of, but that she should not be afraid of. She left on a Tuesday in March of 1911. Her father drove her to the train station in the wagon. Her mother packed food for the journey that was far more than she could eat. At the platform, Thomas Graybill held his daughter's hands for a long moment and didn't say anything, and then he said, "I will," she said. She meant it. She just didn't know when. The journey to China in 1911 was not romantic. It was a train to San Francisco, then a steamship for 22 days across the Pacific, then a smaller boat, then another boat, then 3 days overland by cart and then on foot. She arrived in the province of Hunan with a small trunk, a Chinese Bible, a grammar book with broken binding from overuse, $20 and the name of a missionary couple, the Hargroves, who had agreed by letter to let her stay with them for the first month while she found her footing. The Hargroves were kind. They were also exhausted. They had been in Hunan for 11 years, and they had buried one child there and watched their health slowly diminish, and they carried the weight of that with great faith and quiet grief. They welcomed Millie into their home and fed her and helped her navigate the first confusing weeks. And when she asked them what they found most difficult, Mrs. Hargrove, a small woman from Ohio named Dorothea, said without hesitating, "The praying. You can't sustain what you're doing here without prayer. And prayer is the one thing no one teaches you and no one can do for you." Millie said, "I know." They became close friends. Dorothea later said that Millie prayed more consistently and more deeply than anyone she had ever known. Not in a showy way, but in the way a fire burns when you have given it steady fuel over a long time, and it has had room to grow. Within a few months, Millie had moved to a smaller town 2 days further inland, a market town on the Xiang River called Chuanping. It wasn't on most missionary maps. It had a small church started 12 years earlier by a Scottish missionary who had died of fever, tended now by a local man named Elder Joe, who was 63 years old, and who had been quietly, faithfully holding that small congregation together through famine and flood and political upheaval, with the unassuming tenacity of a man who has decided that this is simply what he will do for as long as he can do it. Elder Joe was suspicious of Millie at first. Not unkindly suspicious, carefully so. He had watched several foreign missionaries come through Chuanping with large energy and short attention spans, and he was protecting his people the way a farmer protects a field he has nursed through hard seasons. They sat together over tea the first week, and she asked him about the town. He answered. She asked about the congregation. He answered. She asked about the prayer life of the church. He looked at her for a long moment. "Weak," he said finally in Mandarin. "We pray for safety, for health, for the harvest. We do not know how to pray for fire." Millie nodded. "I didn't either," she said, "for a long time." He looked at her differently after that. 1911 was not a quiet year in China. The Qing dynasty was failing. Warlords were moving. The country was sliding toward revolution, and everyone who had lived there long enough could feel it in the way you feel weather before it arrives. In October, the Wuchang Uprising began, and within weeks, the empire that had stood for 260 years was coming apart. Millie stayed. The Hargroves sent word asking if she was coming back to their compound in the larger city. She wrote back saying no. She was in Chuanping with Elder Joe and the congregation, and she did not believe she was meant to leave. She was afraid. She wrote that honestly in her journal, which she kept in a small book with a brown cover, that she eventually filled completely and started again in the margins. She was afraid, and she stayed anyway, and she prayed. This is perhaps the thing that is hardest to communicate across a century, because we live in a world that has reduced prayer to a category of religious behavior, something people do in church, before meals, in moments of crisis. What Millie was doing in Chuanping in the winter of 1911 was different in the same way that a river is different from a drinking glass. Both hold water. One of them moves. She prayed every morning beginning at 4 o'clock. She prayed in her small room in the house behind the church that Elder Joe had made available to her. She prayed on her knees on a reed mat, and she did not keep track of how long, because she had learned that keeping track of time was a way of staying in charge, and she had come to Chuanping to surrender something she had been holding too tightly for too long. She did not pray for revival. Not at first. She prayed to know the God she was praying to. She prayed to be emptied of what she later called the ambition to be used, which she said was one of the most subtle and durable obstacles she had ever encountered, because it looked so much like faithfulness from the inside. She sat in that room, and she was honest about what she found when she got quiet. She found pride. She found fear. She found the need to justify the decision she had made against everyone's advice and the deep human desire to be proven right. She laid all of it out, piece by piece, in those early morning hours, and she asked for it to be taken. It took most of the winter. By spring, something had changed in her. The people in the congregation noticed before she did. Elder Joe noticed before anyone. He said to Dorothea Hargrove, who had come to visit in April. "She is not the same woman who arrived in September." Dorothea asked him what he meant. He thought for a while and then said, "She has become still, and the stillness is not empty." In May of 1912, a woman came to the church in Chuanping who had walked 4 hours from a village further into the hills. Her name was Bao Yu. She was 40 years old, and she had a daughter who had not spoken in 3 years. Not since a fever that had left her hearing intact, but her speech completely gone. Every doctor she had found had told her the same thing in different words, which was that nothing could be done. Someone in her village had heard that there was an American woman in Chuanping who prayed in a way that was different. Bao Yu had no particular framework for this information. She was not a Christian. She had spent her savings on doctors, and she had nothing left to spend except 4 hours of walking. So she walked. She arrived on a Thursday afternoon, and Elder Joe brought her to Millie, who was teaching a small group of women from the congregation. Millie stopped the lesson and sat with Bao Yu and listened to the whole story through Elder Joe's translation, and then she asked Bao Yu what she believed. Bao Yu said she didn't know what to believe. She said she just needed her daughter to speak. Millie said, "That's enough. Let's pray." What happened next is documented in 3 separate accounts: Elder Joe's written record, Dorothea Hargrove's letter to her sister in Ohio, and a brief account in a small missionary journal published in Shanghai in 1913. All 3 accounts agree on the substance of it. Millie prayed. She prayed simply. She used no theatrical language. She did not pray at length. She placed her hand on Bao Yu's arm, and she spoke to God about the daughter the way her own mother had spoken to God about Caleb in the dark room in Indiana 20 years before, with the ease of someone talking to a neighbor across a fence. 3 days later, Bao Yu's daughter spoke. She said her mother's name. Just that. 2 syllables carried on breath that had been held for 3 years. Bao Yu came back to Chuanping. She brought her daughter. She brought her sister. She stayed. Word moves fast in places where not much else does. By the summer of 1912, people were coming to Chuanping from villages that had no name on any map Millie owned. Farmers and merchants and women who had been told for years that their problems were too common for God to bother with. They came and they were prayed for, and some of them were healed in ways that could be documented, and some of them were changed in ways that couldn't be documented but were just as real. And the small church that Elder Joe had been quietly holding together since the Scottish missionaries' fever finally gave out, that church began to fill. Millie did not put herself at the center of it. This was not humility as performance. She genuinely understood by now that the moment she became the thing people were coming to see, the thing itself would stop happening. She had prayed that winter to be emptied of the ambition to be used, and she had meant it, and God had taken her at her word. She taught. She prayed. She sat with people. She deferred constantly to Elder Joe, who at 64 was navigating a revolution-era China. With a steadiness that she admired completely, she learned from him. She let herself be taught. She was not the main character in her own story, which is perhaps the reason the story grew. By 1913, there were 3 new congregations within a day's walk of Chuanping, all of them started by people from the original church who had gone home and could not keep what they had found to themselves. Elder Joe trained the leaders. Millie prayed. Dorothea Hargrove wrote to her sister that year, "I came out here thinking the missionary was the one who brought the fire. Millie has shown me that the missionary is simply the one who tends it. The fire comes from somewhere else entirely." The years between 1914 and 1920 were not gentle ones. The revolution had settled into a kind of violent instability that was worse in some ways than the collapse that had produced it. In 1917, there were soldiers in Chuanping for 6 weeks. Men from a warlord's army who were hungry and frightened and armed, which is the most dangerous combination of conditions a human being can present. Elder Joe negotiated with their commander. Millie stayed in the church every night those 6 weeks and prayed without stopping until sunrise, slept for a few hours and started again. She got sick in 1918, influenza, the same pandemic that was killing millions across the world that year. She was 33 years old, and she was genuinely near death for 11 days, and the congregation in Chuanping prayed for her with the same tenacity she had modeled for them. and she recovered. She wrote about that period with a striking honesty. She said she had spent the first 5 days bargaining with God, and the next 3 days in something she could only describe as absence. A place where prayer wasn't possible, and she wasn't sure whether she believed anything at all. And then, on the 9th day, lying on a cot in the back room of the church with a wet cloth on her forehead, and Elder Josu's wife sitting beside her reading Psalms aloud, something settled in her chest like a weight being put down after a long carrying. She wrote, "I stopped asking to live. I just rested in the fact that he knew my name. That was enough. That was, I think, what I had been trying to learn how to do for 20 years. She recovered. She was thinner after it, quieter in a way that had nothing to do with weakness. She stayed in Chuanping. In 1921, a young man arrived at the church on a Tuesday morning with a letter from a pastor in Shanghai. His name was Wei. He was 22 years old, and he had come from a family that had been Christian for 2 generations, and he had been educated in a mission school, and he wanted to know how to pray. He had, he said, been in churches his whole life. He had been taught doctrine and memory verses and hymns. He knew the forms. He did not know what Millie knew. He couldn't name what Millie knew. He just knew, from the reports that had been circulating in Shanghai for the past several years, that something was happening in Chuanping that wasn't happening in most churches, and he wanted to understand it. He thought she would teach him a method. She sat him down and gave him tea and said, "There's no method." He looked confused. He said, "Then what is there?" She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Willingness, and time, and honesty about what's inside you when you get quiet." He stayed for 3 months. He prayed in the early mornings in the small room she made available to him, adjacent to the room where she had been praying since 1911. He found what she had warned him he would find. The pride, the fear, the manageable version of God he had been comfortable with. The ambition dressed as devotion. He worked through it, slowly, with her guidance and Elder Joe's and a great deal of silence. He went back to Shanghai changed. He told people what he had experienced. He did not teach them a method. He taught them what Millie had taught him, which was a posture, a way of entering prayer as surrender rather than as transaction. Within 2 years, there was a quiet movement in the churches of Shanghai and Nanjing that traced its roots directly to what Wei had brought back from Chuanping. Leaders came to visit Millie. Pastors came to sit in on the early morning prayer time. A woman from a church in Wuhan came and stayed for 6 weeks and went home and started what she called the hidden hours in her own congregation, a practice of early morning prayer that made no promises and offered no program and simply opened space. It spread the way fire spreads when the conditions are right, not by force, not by organization, but by a kind of contagion of the real thing meeting the hunger that is always, always there. Millie went home to Indiana once in 1923. Her father had died. She had gotten the telegram in Chuanping 3 weeks after Thomas Graybill was buried. She arrived in Terre Haute on a September afternoon to find her mother smaller and slower, but still entirely herself. Still running on strong coffee, and the absolute conviction that God had placed her family in her hands for a reason. They sat at the same kitchen table where Millie had read the letter from Clara Forsyth in 1904, the letter she had put in her Bible in the book of Isaiah, and they drank coffee and talked for 4 days straight. Nella asked her about China. Millie told her everything, Bao Yu and her daughter, Elder Joe and the revolution, the weeks with the soldiers, the influenza, Wei's 3 months, the movement in Shanghai. Nella listened the way she had always listened, completely, with the full attention of a woman who has learned that listening is its own kind of prayer. At the end of the 4th day, Nella said, "Are you going back?" Millie said, "Yes." Nella nodded. She reached across the table and took her daughter's hand and held it for a moment. Then she said, "I always knew you would go somewhere. I just prayed you'd carry the same fire I saw in you when you were 12. Millie said, "I carry what you showed me." Nella shook her head. "I showed you hunger. He gave you the fire." Millie went back to China. She did not see her mother again. Nella Graybill died in the winter of 1926 and was buried in the churchyard in Terre Haute, and Millie heard the news in Chuanping and sat in her room alone for a long time and then walked to the church and prayed until morning. The years from 1924 to 1932 were, by most measures, the most fruitful of her life, which is a strange thing to say about a decade that included civil war, famine, and the slow grinding away of everything that had seemed stable. China was in constant upheaval. Foreign missionaries were targets, sometimes violently. 2 mission compounds in nearby provinces were destroyed. Millie was warned multiple times by consular officials that she should leave. She prayed about it each time. She stayed each time. She was not reckless. She was not performing bravery. She was, by this point, a woman who had learned to live in the hidden place with enough consistency that the peace she carried there was not contingent on the conditions outside it. This is the thing her journals returned to, again and again. Not courage as the absence of fear, but something more durable than courage. She wrote, "I am afraid of many things. I am more afraid of being somewhere God has not placed me than of remaining where He has." By 1930, the network of churches that had grown from the Chuanping revival included more than 40 congregations across 3 provinces. Millie had visited many of them, had prayed in most of them, had trained leaders in a handful of them. She was 45 years old. Her hair was going gray, and she had a persistent cough from the cold winters. And her Mandarin at this point was genuinely better than her English in certain registers of expression. She was as content as she had ever been in her life. Elder Zhou died in 1931. He was 82 years old, and he died as he had lived, which is to say quietly and with full faith, and with his hand being held by his wife of 54 years. Millie sat with him in his last days, and she told him what he had meant to her. The patience of his welcome, the depth of his faithfulness, the 50 years he had tended a church in a town most missionary maps had forgotten. He said to her, 3 days before he died, "You came to teach us how to pray, but you stayed long enough to learn how to stay. That is the greater gift." She held his hand and wept and was not embarrassed by it. She died in Chuanping in 1947. She was 61 years old. The cause was a combination of things that had been slowly accumulating. The winters. The years of inadequate food during the worst of the wartime scarcity. The body paying at the end what it had given on credit through the middle. She died in the same room where she had prayed every morning since 1911. She died in September, which was her mother's favorite month, which she had always taken as a particular grace. The church in Chuanping was full at her memorial service. People came from villages that were half a day's walk away. Wei came from Shanghai, where he was now a pastor, leading a congregation of several hundred people who had never heard of Millie Graybill, but who worshipped with a depth and a freedom that traced, through a long chain of influence, back to a reed mat in a small room on the Xiang River, where a stubborn woman from Indiana had learned to stop asking for what she wanted and to rest instead in what she knew. Her trunk was found by the couple who cleared her room. The brown journal, filled and written in the margins. The Chinese Bible, worn completely through at the Psalms and Isaiah, and at the very bottom, still folded, still tucked in the same place she had placed it 43 years before. The letter from Clara Forsyth in the book of Isaiah. She had kept it for 36 years after coming to China. She had never needed to read it again. She had simply needed to know for a season that someone else had gone first. They called what happened in Chuanping a revival. Historians of Chinese Christianity have written about it. Not extensively, because there were other revivals with larger numbers and more dramatic moments and better documentation. The Chuanping revival was quiet. It didn't produce famous preachers or spectacular incidents. What it produced was a network of ordinary people who had learned how to pray in a way that was real, and who had taught that to someone else, and who had watched it move in circles wider than they could see. The woman who started it never wrote a book. She never spoke at a conference. She never had a salary or a mission board or a letter of endorsement from anyone with credentials. She had a reed mat and 40 years and the willingness to stay in the room. And God, who does not seem to be particularly impressed by the things we are most proud of, used her in the way He most often uses people, not because of what she had, but because of what she had given up, not because of what she achieved, but because of what she became in the hidden place where no one was watching. If He could carry a fire across 3 provinces through a fatherless farm girl from Indiana, with no training and no organization, and not a single person's blessing except her mother's. What might he be waiting to do through you?